It's the Australia Institute's End of Financial Year appeal. If you love how Follow the Money explains economics in plain English and how our research helps you cut through the spin and econobabble, please consider making a tax-deductible contribution at australiainstitute.org.au today. Even better, thanks to 2 generous donors, every dollar donated between now and 30th of June will be matched dollar for dollar until we reach our goal. So you will double your impact if you make a contribution today.
Using a method developed by some radical lefty pinkos known as the European Central Bank. We used a method developed by the European Central Bank, applied that to Australia, and it just made clear that profits were doing causing far more of the inflation than wages.
And so when we're talking about profits, we've already mentioned energy companies. Who else is in that company?
Oh, plucky little companies doing their best like Qantas, the banks, Coles and Woolworths. They're all having a really tough crisis. So when I say tough, I mean tough to count their record profits that are just rolling in.
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The Treasurer knows.
I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains big economic issues in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and we all know that Australians have been experiencing a dramatic rise in the cost of living thanks to inflation. While the business sector was quick to blame wages for rising inflation, the Australia Institute and the Centre for Future Work took a look at the data, and it told a very different story.
Woolworths has posted a $1.5 billion profit for the last financial.
Australia's biggest bank has unveiled a record-breaking profit.
In just 6 months, Commonwealth Bank made a thumping $5.15 billion.
Westpac has notched up a $4 billion profit. ANZ unveiled its highest ever cash profit of $3.82 billion.
Major Australian companies have been reporting massive profits, and they're having a big impact on inflation.
The headline inflation number has ticked up to 6.8%.
Finding grocery inflation is hitting new highs.
Inflation becomes entrenched. It's very costly.
Just today, the Reserve Bank has lifted the official cash rate to 4.1%. This is the 12th rate rise since May last year.
We hear the Reserve Bank Governor talk about the worries he has about a price-wage spiral.
While the Reserve Bank is worried about people's wages being too high, the data shows that inflation would actually have stayed within the Reserve Bank's target range.
69% of that inflation is caused by excess profits from large corporations.
There's no doubt the question of what is causing the current rate of inflation is an important one, and not just for Australia. This is a topic of debate for governments, central banks and economists all around the world. But how we fight inflation will affect all Australians. The Reserve Bank has the blunt tool of interest rate rises, while the government has the more precision tool of fiscal policy like it uses in the budget. But what should they be targeting to reduce inflation? If you listen to business, we should keep wages low. But what if wages aren't really driving inflation? The Australia Institute has put out a series of research reports showing the role of excessive corporate profits in driving inflation, and that's ruffled a few feathers. To explain why, I'm joined by Executive Director of the Australia Institute, Richard Dennis. G'day, Richard.
Hey, Eb.
Richard, firstly, what is inflation and why do we try to control it? Let's start with the basics.
Yeah, so you hear about inflation all the time, and inflation refers to general increases in the price level in a country. Now, in Australia, we usually measure inflation through something called the Consumer Price Index, the CPI, but that's only one of many ways that we can measure inflation in Australia and around the world. So starting with the Consumer Price Index, as a hint in the name, it's an index of consumer prices. And the Australian Bureau of Statistics, the ABS, literally every month go out to hundreds of shops across all of our capital cities, thousands in fact, looking for prices of everything from petrol to bread to milk to mobile phone plans and rent. And really importantly, we only collect data on prices, consumer prices, in our capital cities. we're not paying any attention to the price of milk or lettuce out in remote Queensland or Northern Territory. So we don't really know much about the cost of living in Indigenous communities, for example. But what we do know is that over time, we've got a long time series of consumer price index data, and generally speaking, the Reserve Bank tries to keep the consumer price index pretty stable, and the RBA targets 2 to 3% inflation measured through the consumer price index.
Okay, and so why do they try and keep it between that 2 and 3%?
Oh, it's heaps better than 2.5 or 3.5. And I mean, imagine how silly if we had 1.9 to 2.9. No, these numbers are arbitrary.
Okay.
There's no right number here. 0 would be too low, 10 would be too high, 5 seemed high, 1 seemed low. How about we have a range? How big a range? Good question, I hear you ask. So different countries have different targets, but we've settled on 2 to 3%. And interestingly, we've had this target for decades, and we live in really unique times at the moment. We've had a COVID supply shock, we've had a war in Europe. There's really no reason to expect that inflation should be 2 to 3% right now.
Yeah.
But the Reserve Bank, to a man with a hammer, the whole world is a nail, they've been told for decades, got to have inflation of 2 to 3%, not brackets unless there's a war or something, or unless there's a global pandemic. So we've got this 2 to 3% target range. It's not in the RBA Act. It's not legislated. Parliament's never said you must do this, but culturally that's what we've got used to. And 2 to 3% is as useful as 2.5 to 3.5. But I don't think we should take these ranges nearly as seriously as very serious people are prone to do.
Yeah. And so, as you've said, we've got a war in Europe. Russia's invaded Ukraine. We know the impact that in particular has had on energy prices, but a few other things as well. And as you said, we had some supply shocks during the COVID pandemic crisis.
And things like climate change are driving up the price of insurance.
Yeah.
Like we're really living in strange times.
Yeah.
Good evening. Nearly 3 million workers are set to benefit from a historic pay decision as the independent wages umpire unveils the biggest increase to the minimum wage and award rates on record.
Some economists argue today's decision could also increase pressure on mortgage holders as it heightens the chance of the Reserve Bank hiking rates next week.
Are we seeing a wage price spiral? Is this what's going to happen?
We don't want to see that.
We definitely don't want to see that.
Why are you so confident that these wage increases will not drive inflation up even further?
Wages is just one of the issues that gets weighed up in all the different issues talking about inflation. These are the people who are the lowest paid. It's 10% of the total wage growth across the country. It's a real stretch to start blaming cleaners for interest rate decisions.
And so when inflation really started to rise dramatically and beyond the RBA's target, it did seem that initially workers got a lot of the blame. Initially, we heard a lot about wage price spirals. What's that?
Well, that's victim blaming. That's Australia. Find the vulnerable group and blame them for what's going on. Look, back in the 1970s, a lot of people think that Australian wages, that unions demand high wages and that drove a lot of inflation. The data on that isn't as settled as our history would suggest, but the terminology was developed of a wage price spiral, and that was greedy workers demanded high wages, firms had to respond, poor firms, they were the victims, so they increased their prices, and then the workers realised, hey, hang on, we wanted higher wages so we could buy more stuff, you just increased the price of stuff, so I'll have another wage rise, and on it went. So the argument back from the 70s and 80s was that workers started it, firms responded but with higher prices, then workers went again. So this wage price spiral idea is pretty burned into the Australian sort of economic psyche. So as soon as we had an outbreak of inflation in Australia, there was clearly about imported products got expensive, particularly thanks to supply shocks during COVID. Energy prices went through the roof. Had nothing to do with wages.
Yeah.
But the minute it happened, that old rhetoric got wheeled out. Oh, you better be careful.
Yeah.
Prices are going up. If employees ask for pay rises now, that'll kick off a wage price spiral, even though we know it started with the prices, not the wages. So, the idea of a wage price spiral is if workers ask for higher wages, ultimately, it will be ineffective because firms will just increase their prices anyway. So you'll never get a wage rise, Ed. Like tough. Sucks to be you. If it looks like you get a pay rise, firms will just punish you with higher prices. So you might as well just not ask for a pay rise.
Yeah. And because that's essentially, what happened. All these warnings of is this going to be a wage price spiral? There was headlines everywhere. So the Australia Institute did decide to take a look at the data and see where inflation was coming from, to disaggregate it, I think would be the term. So what did it show?
Well, that there was a profit price spiral. That what was happening is that there were cost increases. Some energy was going up. The price of energy was going up. Some imported materials were going up. But firms were actually increasing their prices even faster than those cost increases. So we saw the share of GDP, the profit share of GDP rising. We saw that profits and prices were rising a lot faster than wages. But despite that, we were still either saying workers were causing inflation or workers better just take that cut in their real wages, that is their wages adjusted for inflation. They should just take that on the chin because if they asked for bigger pay rises, they would, if they weren't the cause of the first round of inflation, they would be the cause of the second round of inflation. So, the data that we pulled together using a method developed by some radical lefty pinkos known as the European Central Bank. We used a method developed by the European Central Bank, applied that to Australia, and it just made clear that profits were doing causing far more of the inflation than wages.
And so when we're talking about profits, we've already mentioned energy companies. Who else is in that company?
Oh, plucky little companies doing their best like Qantas, the banks, Coles and Woolworths. They're all having a really tough crisis. So when I say tough, I mean tough to count their record profits that are just rolling in. So, it's true. It is true that a lot of the profits being earned in Australia are being earned by the mining industry. And by the way, that's a good problem to have. Not many people in Saudi Arabia panic when the price of oil goes up. They go, oh no, here we are in the world's largest oil exporter.
What will we do?
What will we do with all our money? But in Australia, when the price, and we're the largest exporter of liquefied natural gas, we're the largest or second largest exporter of coal. So you've got gas prices going up, coal prices going up. And in Australia, rather than thinking ka-ching, actually, because so much of our mining industry is foreign owned, what's happened is Australians are paying much higher prices for energy, and it didn't all of a sudden get expensive to extract coal or gas in Australia, just the world price went up. So foreign-owned companies are like, thank you for stuffing tens of billions of windfall profits into my pockets. So the mining industry is doing really well in Australia. It could obviously afford to pay its workers much higher wages, but strangely it chooses not to. But it's not just the mining industry whose profits have gone up. We know that. You just have to pick up the newspaper, let alone go look at the national accounts data.
UBS economist Paul Donovan says the broadening of inflation beyond commodity prices is more profit margin expansion than wage cost pressures.
We've definitely got a profit crisis at the moment. It's driving inflation. It's the reason why inflation is high.
What inflation has caused them to pass on $160 billion in excess profits from these large corporations, and only 18% of the inflation is caused by what people imagine as a wage prices spiral.
I did want to ask a little bit about that methodology and why we used that approach, and why does that show something different to everyone else claiming that there's a wages price spiral?
Well, firstly, because the people saying there was a wages price spiral never put any data out there. It was just common sense. Hey, everybody, we can punch down and, if there's a problem in Australia, what do? We typically, we blame the unemployed, for their unemployment. Why not blame workers whose real wages are falling for our inflation. So what we did was we used this data developed by the European Central Bank. It's a radical method. It's other radical organisations like the Bank of England have used it. Parts of the Federal Reserve in the US have used it. Look, what the method allows you to do is use macroeconomic data, the data from the GDP, to break down what's happening to inflation into its composite parts, to disaggregate at the macro level. And you often hear people talk about unit wage costs. It's a little bit of econobabble that describes how much a unit of GDP, stuff, what are the wage costs to make a unit of GDP? Well, this method allows you to come up with a unit profit cost as well, because we all know that wages can push up inflation, but apparently it's not polite in Australia to say, well, profits can too. So using this method developed by the European Central Bank, used by other central banks, used by us, it's quite clear that unit profit costs rather than unit wage costs have been a major contributor to inflation in Australia.
So it's not like a novel approach. It's one used kind of in lots of different places. We just haven't really used it in Australia in the past. Is that right?
Exactly. It's novel to use it in Australia where we don't need data. We just know. We just know.
Why look into it when we know wages is the problem?
Exactly. So we took that approach and we described the European Central Bank method and we've put the results out there.
And that's ruffled a few feathers, Richard.
Yes, it has. Yes, and quite a diverse range of feathers, but certainly business groups don't like what we're saying. They much would prefer to say, how about workers just accept real wage reductions and stop causing macroeconomic problems. But look, the Reserve Bank and Treasury have both written critiques of our work. And if you read those critiques carefully, which thanks to an FOI request, very well-timed, well-targeted FOI requests, those RBA and Treasury critiques of our work are out there, they don't actually find any errors at all in our maths. They don't find any errors at all in our application of the method. What they do is they say, it's silly to use that method. Flawed, indeed, was how it was described by some. But to be clear, the method we used is the European Central Bank method. The Bank of England and others have used it. The flaws that others have described are not flaws, they're actually just parts of the method that we described. So to get a bit technical, at the beginning I talked about the Consumer Price Index, the CPI. That's one measure of inflation. There's another measure of inflation that doesn't just include consumer goods, it includes intermediate goods. So, for example, I don't know about you, Ed, but I don't go buy coal very often.
No, I haven't in a long time, Richard.
Well, get out there. I collect it, put it on your mantelpiece. But look, machinery, coal, all ball bearings, things that go into machines, they're called intermediate goods or raw materials. They're not in the Consumer Price Index. But there's another thing called the GDP deflator, and the way the national accounts are put together, it's quite easy to use the GDP deflator. It's literally impossible to use the Consumer Price Index. The people at the European Central Bank knew this when they developed the method. So some people have said, but you're not even using the Consumer Price Index. It's like, well, you can't. We're using national accounts data, so you have to use national accounts concepts. That's a bit technical, but the point, I suppose, is that the flaws that people are describing that that have been asserted that that exist in our research are not flaws; they're simply descriptions of a well-used method. Similarly, some people have said, but Australia's special, Australia's different. Most of those profits come from the mining industry. When you look at non-mining profits, this isn't such a problem. So
Why would you exclude mining profits, Richard?
Exactly. It's like saying take all the tall people out of a class and say that on average they're not very tall. Exactly. Look, and our research makes these same points. They're kind of saying, look, it's not the mining company's fault that they're making all this profit. It's not their fault. Poor things. Like the world price went up. They have no choice. They have no choice but to charge those high prices.
The oil and gas giants made half-year profits of more than $1 billion.
BP and Total, the big five, raked in an astounding $190 billion last year.
But you know what? 10 years ago, there was a choice because we didn't export most of our gas. It was just sold to Australians. We made policy choices that linked the gas price in Australia to the world price. And now, thanks to that policy decision, we're spending a fortune on gas. They're making enormous profits. So, yeah, the idea that we should just ignore the fact that the fossil fuel industry is having a bumper crisis is convenient for people that want to keep blaming workers. But to be clear, if we, for example, had a windfall profits tax on the gas industry, something Nobel Prize-winning economist Joe Stiglitz said for a country like Australia would be a no-brainer, well, we could collect tens of billions of dollars in tax, and we could spend that reducing the price of things. We could control inflation by taxing these windfall profits and spending the money to push the price of things like dental care, medical care, education services down. So, yeah, it's very nice that some people would say, if we leave the most profitable industries out, profits aren't rising that fast in Australia. Like, yeah, I see what you did there. But to be clear, A, profits are profits and we could tax them if we wanted to, and B, a whole bunch of other industries are experiencing rapid growth in profits as well, not just the mining industry.
In fact, I think I saw Rod Sims, the former ACCC chair, kind of talk about the role of oligopolies, is that the right word?
That's right, exactly. So former chair of the ACCC, Rod Sims, says pretty much, same point we're making, that profits in the retail sector, particularly Coles and Woolworths, are contributing to our inflation. So the idea that we should go, oh, look, Coles and Woolworths are jacking up prices and making record profits, let's increase interest rates. Like, yeah, that's maybe not the shortest route to victory.
Yeah.
And that's really the reason that we've done all this research, is that if we just think that the only thing that ever drives inflation is rampant consumer spending, then it follows that maybe you want to jack up interest rates to curb consumer spending sometimes. But when it's oligopoly market power, when it's imported energy prices from a war in Europe, then record interest rate increases aren't really going to be a very effective way to control those problems.
And it's amazing how increasing wages is never the answer to any
no.
problems.
No. Oh, yeah, come on. Now you're just being silly.
So just sticking with the critiques of this for a minute before we move on to bigger things, is part of the problem or part of the critique of our research is that there's not a definite causal link between profits and inflation.
Yeah. So some people have said, oh, look, okay, your numbers are spot on. No problem with your numbers. You've shown that prices have gone up, profits have gone up, and inflation's gone up. But are you sure that you know which caused which?
The chicken or the egg?
Yeah, what came first here? So, look, so there's a number of ways to respond to that. And the easiest is, well, you know what, maybe in 5 or 10 years' time, when we can look back with the luxury of 5 or 10 years' data, we can use different analytical tools than we can use today. But the Reserve Bank is setting interest rates monthly. The Fair Work Commission just increased wages. So we need to actually make decisions right now, in the here and now, using the data that's available. So step one, the data we've used is available, and we're using a method that other central banks have used, so it makes a lot of sense. And then secondly, when it comes to causation, it's like, well, just because two things happened at the same time, how do you know which one caused something? So imagine you're walking up the street and a dog barks. Did the dog bark because you walked up the street, or did you walk up the street because the dog barked? How can we know? We've just got two observations. Ebony walked up the street and a dog barked. Maybe it was your dog. You heard it barking, so you walked up there to find it. Maybe the dog barks at people when they walk past. So economists really are interested in causation, but especially in the short term, especially when things are happening, we can't use a lot of statistical tests to kind of be 100% certain about what's causing what. But we can use our theoretical models, and we can use history, and we can actually use our knowledge as economists to ask, do I think inflation is causing high prices, or do I think high price increases are causing inflation? And I think there's enough data around to feel confident that that firms increasing their prices at much higher rates than their costs are going up is why we're seeing inflation. Some economists want to disagree with that. Maybe in 5 years' time we can have a fascinating seminar. But again, we're not the ones that invented this method, and we're not the only ones drawing this conclusion. Indeed, the European Central Bank have drawn this conclusion that profit increases are a significant contributor to inflation in Europe.
But not everywhere. So correct me if I'm wrong, but the Bank of England used the same thing, but to show profits weren't driving inflation there.
That's right.
Is that right?
Yeah, which is a kind of further proof that the method is a useful method to use.
Yeah.
It doesn't always generate the same answers, and England and Australia aren't the same.
The price of Vegemite has increased by 8%, peanut butter by 9%, yogurt has increased by 12%.
The fact is, I'm asked about food. And of the G7 countries, this is where they're at. Canada, 10.5. France, 15.6.
The Deputy
Germany,
and the Shadow Treasurer will cease
Italy,
projecting.
13. UK, 18.1. United States, 9.9. Every single one of those countries has higher food inflation. You can't be more specific than this than Australia.
So, Richard, if monetary policy is a bit of a hammer, looking for a nail everywhere, what are the other ways that we can be addressing inflation?
Yeah, great question. So in Australia, we've really come to believe that if you want to control inflation, it's interest rate policy, monetary policy that does it. And we want to get to 2 to 3%, 2 to 3% inflation because, arbitrary range. But the reality is there's lots of other ways we can control inflation. So competition policy, actually making it harder for firms to merge, cracking down on collusion, basically making firms compete harder with each other to push prices down is a really good way. It's not going to happen instantly, but we really should be having a national conversation about that.
You should probably be doing it anyway.
Exactly. And I think that countries like Australia, which have really high degrees of market power, we just take for granted this, Coles and Woolworths have dominant market share, Virgin and Qantas dominant market share, big four banks.
Telstra and Optus,
right? So Australia has a highly concentrated economy. So we're probably more prone to profit-driven inflation than a lot of other countries. And then in addition to the competition policy, as you said in the introduction, there's also fiscal policy, tax and spending policy. The Australian Institute's been saying from the beginning of this crisis, there's lots governments can do to directly control some prices. And we saw this in the budget, which is quite exciting. So from day one, we've been saying, hang on, government's in control of how much people pay to go to public unis. Government's in control of how much we pay to a large extent to go to the GP, or what we pay for our medicines, or what we pay for childcare. So we've been arguing that government should be collecting more revenue, particularly windfall profits from the gas industry and the coal industry. And if we spend that money literally lowering the prices that governments control, well, those prices show up in the consumer price index. So by making university cheaper, by making childcare cheaper, by making access to dentistry and pharmaceuticals cheaper, we can actually make inflation lower. And that's using fiscal policy to achieve it, which in Australia is a radical idea, but hey, I guess think tanks make the radical seem reasonable. 2 years ago it was crazy. This year we saw the Treasurer starting down that road in the budget. Imagine if they came out and said, we're going to make childcare free. Imagine if they came out and said, we're going to lower the cost of HECS for university students. Those decisions would have significant impact on the consumer price index and make the RBA's obsession with getting 2 to 3% inflation far easier to achieve.
Thanks very much, Richard.
Thanks, Eb.
This episode... Fixed it.
Fixed it.
This episode was recorded on Monday the 5th of June 2023, and things may have changed since recording. If you liked today's episode, please rate and review us. It helps other people to find the show. And if you love the show and want to help us continue to do work with impact and influence, please consider supporting us, our end of financial year appeal, with a small tax-deductible gift today at australiainstitute.org.au. That's also where you'll find all our latest research and content, including on profits, and we're on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. My Twitter handle is ebony_Bennett with a double N double T. Richard Dennis is at RDNS_TAI. Our producer is Jennifer Macy. You can find her at Jennifer Macy, with additional editing by Emily Perkins. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. Thanks for listening.